Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. We're going to continue on now with the Gospel of Matthew. We're focusing now on Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to about 16. Now, this is a point in the story of the Gospel of Matthew where Herod is going to slaughter all the children living in Bethlehem. Now, we've established that Matthew has established that the birth, or at least the place of the very early youth of Jesus, was Bethlehem. Now, we'll be seeing in the other videos when we get to like the Gospel of Mark and John whether they established that Bethlehem was the very early home of Jesus Christ, but that's for later. What we want to focus on now is the departure from Bethlehem to Egypt. Now, there is a point in the story where the angel says to Joseph to get up and take his wife and child, the Virgin Mary and Jesus, to Egypt because Herod is about to slaughter every young child living in Bethlehem. We know the story. Herod was convinced the Messiah would be born there because of his conversation with the Magi, and wanted to kill all the young boys because he obviously does not want the Messiah to take his kingship. Now, what's interesting is that that's all relevant for another discussion, but what's interesting, what I want to point out, is the prophecy when Herod had basically done this. The angel appears to Joseph and says, basically it says, quote, "So he got up and took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled when the Lord had said through the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" End quote. Now that's Matthew chapter 2, verses 14 to about 16. Now, what's interesting is looking at the context of this prophecy. Now, again, Matthew is taking things out of context, and I've discussed this prophecy in another video as well. But since we're doing an analysis of the Gospel of Matthew, we'll go through it again. This actually goes back to the prophet Hosea. Now, Hosea is not mentioned by name in the Gospel of Matthew. In this particular Greek document, he says vaguely the prophet. He gives no reference to which prophet he's talking about. But if we do an analysis, Hosea chapter 11 is clearly where Matthew got this verse from. Because the first verse is when it says, "And I called my son out of Egypt." Now that is verse 1, but that's not all of verse 1. Matthew does not even quote the beginning of this verse. He actually skips a line when it says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt." Now, right there is an interesting note, because now we know who Hosea is talking about, and what God is talking about through the prophet Hosea. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. Now right there you could establish that perhaps he's talking about Jacob, who was later renamed Israel. And we do know for a fact that Israel was called the Son of God in other places in the Old Testament. But what could be confusing to some people is the concept, "and I called my son out of Egypt." But if you continue down with the context, it says, "But the more I called to them, the further they went from me. They have offered sacrifices to the Baals, and set their offerings smoking before the idols. I myself took Eraphim to walk, and I took them in my arms, yet they have not understood that I was the one looking after them. I led them with reins of kindness, with leading strings of love. I was like someone who lifts up an infant close against his cheek, stooping down to him and gave him his food. They will have to go back to Egypt. Assyria must be their king, because they have refused to return to me, the sword with rage through their towns, wiping out their children, glutting itself inside the fortresses." Now, if we look at this entire context, we see that Micah is referring to the concept of slavery for the entire Jewish people. Now, how do we see that? Well, there's allusions to Egypt. There's allusions that God called his people out of Egypt and took them out of bondage. But now he's referring to the Israelites worshiping false idols. And worshiping false idols and committing this sort of blasphemy and sin, and he makes an allusion that they will have to go back to Egypt and Assyria must be their king. So again, he is referring to Israel as the entire country of the Israelites, and he's referring to the illusion of Egypt, meaning bondage, and essentially that the Assyrians will take them over. What's important to note is that the Messiah is not mentioned in this context. Also, in the context, there is no mention that the Messiah will come out of Egypt as a youth. This is not mentioned at all. Again, this has to do with the Assyrians and the impending invasion of the Assyrians and the Assyrians enslaving the Israelites in the context. Now, what's important to note is that this actually goes back to a similar prophecy or a similar concept in the Torah. You have Deuteronomy, which says something to the effect of, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet. This is what you requested of the Lord your God at Horeb and on the day of the assembly when you said, If I hear the voice of the Lord my God any more, or even again see this great fire, I will die. Then the Lord replied to me, They are right in what they have said. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet, who shall speak to them everything that I command. Anyone who does not heed the words of that prophet shall speak in my name. I myself will be accountable." And then it goes on in various other parts of Deuteronomy to explain how you differentiate a false prophet from a true prophet of God, and etc., etc., etc. So with that in mind, this is clearly stating this concept that Hosea is speaking for, or God is speaking through Hosea, saying that if the Israelites still continue this worshiping of a pagan deity, that he will allow Assyria to take them over and they will go back into bondage. Because, now granted, this is an interpretation that other people have come to, but I want to point out that the Messiah is not mentioned in the context. The Anointed One is not mentioned, and it is not mentioned anywhere that the Anointed One will come out of Egypt. Again, it says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt." But there is no mentioning that this son is the Messiah in the context of Micah chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. So with that, I conclude this video. I'd be, again, interested in people's comments. Peace be with you all.